Hey there, this is Natalie, and in this video I want to tackle something I had long buried in the recesses of my memory: Lily Orchard's writing tips. See, I remember when these were first posted. It was a time when I was first starting out on YouTube, but had been working as a writer for about 10 years, and was still engaging a lot with writers' Twitter, and this was doing the rounds as a general source of mockery. That was probably 4 years ago, and I never thought I'd think of it again. However, Lily Orchard is once again the subject of a whole bunch of drama, a lot more serious than her generally terrible media takes. And since this has been the case, a few people have asked me if I'd do a response to this infamous thread. And, well, I'm all for it. Because when people are starting out with an interest in writing and are looking for advice and tips, they really need to see something better than whatever this was. I'm going to be responding to each of the 100 tips on the fly, because trying to script a response was really making me lose the will to live. And so, given how many there are of these and how stupid some of them are, this may end up being a 2-part series. I'll see how I get on. Just very quickly before that though, I still have to do a moment of the embarrassing e-begging. I'm getting my second channel working, it's monetized now, but due to things going badly for me over the summer, I've ended up actually becoming a stray cat girl, and I'm currently living with my dad, which is not a situation that is a permanent option for me. I'm getting there with the combination of the second channel and this one, plus some writing work I've taken on, but I do still really need some help to survive in the meantime. So if you can afford it and want to help your local stray cat girl, then there's a link to my Ko-fi in the description. You do get access to audiobook versions of some of my side story readings, including Old Dragon's Tale, the Mushoku Tensei prequel novel, which is over 7 hours long, just for visiting the page. And that's really just as a thank you, because I really do appreciate your help so much. I'm working really hard at the moment, but I really need your support for just a little bit longer. And with that embarrassing pleading out of the way, let's start on Lily Orchard's 100 crap writing tips. Number 1, don't worry about spoilers. If your story is good, spoilers aren't going to make it any less enjoyable. If spoilers make a story less enjoyable, that just means you are relying on cheap shock value as a shortcut. Well, nobody when they're writing is actually worrying about whether or not in the future, when their story is out there, somebody's going to spoil it. This is very much not a tip for somebody who's in the phases of actually writing something. But whether or not spoilers can make a story less enjoyable depends a lot on the genre and on the people in the audience who are consuming it. There are some things I think that if they're spoiled don't really do anything other than make people more excited to see the thing. Knowing there will be a battle between two characters, for instance, might be a reason why you tune in or read the next volume or even get into a story to begin with. But if it's a story with a mystery at the end, then watching it for the first time or reading it for the first time when you already know how it ends will absolutely make it less enjoyable. Also, as somebody who does discuss spoilers for series like Mushoku Tensei and Re:Zero, where I've read the source material, a lot of anime-onlys do want to know what happens to their favourite characters later on, and they get excited to find that out. But there are other people who absolutely don't want to know anything about something before they go into experiencing it for themselves. I've got a friend who's a big movie buff, and he doesn't even really like knowing how long the movie is or who did the soundtrack, because he considers even those things to be spoilers for the experience he's going to have watching it. That's a bit extreme, but that is the way he feels, and he is a big consumer of stuff, so I think it is right as other fans of something to be considerate when it comes to spoilers. But that's just not a concern for the writer. And a writer who doesn't want an aspect of their story spoiled in advance is not relying on cheap shock value. They just perhaps have elements of their story that they want people to experience for the first time in the way that they wrote them. There's nothing wrong with that. Tip number 2. The middle point of a story is the best time to get a main couple together. Are you working on a 5-season show? Put your main couple together halfway through season 3. The finale is the worst time because we don't get any time to enjoy the payoff. Now I guess Lily's talking about TV writing here because as far as I know she mainly does criticism of children's cartoons. I'm not knocking that, I'm an anime YouTuber, you know, but giving advice on TV writing when the only thing that you've actually got experience of writing yourself, as far as I know, is a very, very sketchy My Little Pony fanfiction called Stockholm, which is apparently not about some ponies going on a lovely holiday to Sweden. Then what the hell do you know about writing for TV? Most people writing for TV don't know they're writing for a 5-season show when they start writing. That's really not something people can predict when they're plotting out the first season of something, unless it's based on some kind of source material, like say novels or comics. And most people looking for writing tips on somewhere like Twitter are probably looking for advice on writing novels or comics. Yes, it can certainly be argued that Lily Orchard's set of tips are not really tips for aspiring writers, but her kind of critique of existing writers in the industry that she is most particularly focused on. But they are still quite prescriptive in places, so I'm going to just treat them as if they're tips for actual aspiring writers. Now, the point of the story when it's best to get a couple together will depend very much on genre. Romance genre fiction, for instance, is literally the story of people getting together. And so for the couple to get together, that kind of has to be in the final act. That's the way that these stories are formulated and what the audience expects from them. And there are genre expectations that you're expected to conform to for something to be considered a part of that genre and appealing to fans of it. If your main couple are already together at the start of the story, that's fine. If they get together in the middle, that's fine too. If they reach the end and don't ever get together, that's also fine. But none of those things would conform to the standards of, say, romance genre fiction. I can therefore assume she's talking about other genres like action, adventure and fantasy, where getting couples together might also be part of the main formula, and where it might be true that putting them together in the middle gives you a chance to enjoy the dynamic of them being a couple. It's not inherently terrible advice if applied to the right genre and to a writer who knows how long their story is going to be, which in TV they may not necessarily, or even with novels or manga. You may get your couple together thinking you're near the end of the story, but the story continues to be in high demand, so you then have to kind of keep going with that premise where you might have changed it if you knew you were going to go on for as long as you have to with these characters. This could be the case with something like Sword Art Online. I don't think that Kirito and Asuna would have become an official couple anywhere near as early in the series as they did if Reki Kawahara had known how long he was going to be working with those characters. Basically, if you're writing romance, put them together at the end. That is the format. If you're writing anything other than romance and want to put romance plotlines into it, do what feels right for the story, the events in the story at the current time, and the characters that you're working with. There are only hard and fast rules when you're dealing with the formalities of a particular genre. And there is certainly no hard and fast rules when it comes to appealing to the taste of random YouTubers who've never written anything that wasn't completely objectionable. Tip number 3, friends to lovers is always better than enemies to lovers, every time. That's just an opinion, isn't it? I'm sure most people can think of times that both of those tropes have been used that they've enjoyed. They can produce different types of chemistry, and both can be interesting to read or write. Within romance fiction, they are actually tags people will search for. So if that's what you're writing and you want commercial success, then your friends to lovers book will do well with people who are looking for friends to lovers, and your enemies to lovers book will do well with people who are looking for that. You do what you promise to the reader. In other types of genre fiction, like action adventure, fantasy, sci-fi, it's really the same as the previous point. Do what works. You can have characters that when you first started writing them you didn't really want to put together, but through events that happen and dialogue that happens between them, you start to build chemistry and you think it might be a good idea to put them together. If that's the case, go with it. A lot of good ideas develop that way. For instance, in the classic light novel and anime series, The Slayers, originally there was no intention for Lena Inverse and Gowry to fall in love. The author said that this just kind of happened as the story went on, that the characters kind of fell in love by themselves. And if you find yourself with something like that with your characters, just go with it. It really doesn't matter what kind of trope they spawned out of, unless that trope is part of the selling point of the thing you're working on. 4. Victims of abuse moving away from the negative impacts of their abuse, i.e. Zuko, and becoming healthier, are not redemption arcs. The fact she says i.e. Zuko, not e.g. Zuko, kind of fits with a tone you're going to see a lot of in this, where a lot of the time she's just talking about something she didn't like about one specific show, or the fandom reaction to one specific show, rather than anything a writer could use. As a writer, you might think, okay, I want to turn this character from an antagonist into an ally to the protagonist. Something that's very common in anime. I might want to have a character who was the big bad have some kind of redeeming qualities in the end, like Darth Vader in Star Wars. So they're redeemed in a final sacrifice or something like that. But you don't generally think this is a redemption arc because this character is evil but they're going to become good. You just think about how you're going to reframe the relationships, perhaps between everybody being against this person and the audience rooting against them, to them moving to become a better person or moving to become more in tune with the good things that were in them all along. For instance, a victim of abuse moving away from the negative impacts of their abuse and becoming healthier would be a way of describing Rudeus Grey Rat in Mushoku Tensei. Some people see this as a redemption story, others think the character was never redeemable to begin with, and others still see it, probably the way the author does, as a story about second chances and how they can be used. It really doesn't matter whether someone calls something a redemption arc or not. The decision when it comes to including it in your story doesn't really rely on the reasons why the person became a person with negative attributes in the beginning. Because to do that would mean to say that anybody who'd been abused was therefore infallible for the rest of the story. All of the blame on their behaviour could be put on things that had happened to them earlier. Those things only make a character understandable and sympathetic. They don't make them infallible. So if they go on to do evil things, and then through the moments of the story they come to feel remorse, they come to change their ways, they come to do beneficial things for the world and the story, then you could see them as redeemed, or you could not. That's really down to how you feel about the character. But the way that Lily puts this, it's almost like you can't have a redemption arc if the reason why the person was an antagonist to begin with, or a bad person to begin with, was because of abuse in their past. And that's just maybe applying too much kind of real-world logic to storytelling. Number 5. Heroes refusing to kill villains who have been shown to actively be trying to murder people isn't noble, it's enabling. Well, Lily mainly talks about children's shows. And anybody killing anybody in children's shows, at least in the West, is very uncommon. So I can see why this would be a trope that would come up a lot in the media you're consuming if you're not consuming media for adults, or at least young adults. I really have never watched any of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, but I would imagine that even the worst characters in that don't get killed anywhere. But there's also a big difference between a hero refusing to actively kill the antagonist at the end, the villain, and them all becoming best buddies. There are other kinds of ways you can punish an antagonist if you don't want to deal with the idea of your protagonist, killing someone. You may have a protagonist that you really don't want to ever do that. This is why you can sometimes get fantasy tropes like people being sealed, or in other types of stories they might be put to trial. So it's not just down to the hero to decide what happens to them. There are lots of ways of tackling this, and I can kind of see where Lily's coming from, because it can be frustrating when the hero has the opportunity to kill the villain and stop them from killing a bunch of other people, but they choose to let them live. But again, that mainly happens in things aimed at children. Or when you want to show that perhaps the hero is merciful to a fault, or even give the hero something to regret later. There are so many ways you can handle these kinds of situations that can be interesting and good writing, that there's really nothing useful here to take away. Tip number 6. 2 women kissing in the last episode of a show after 4 to 5 seasons of trying to murder each other isn't revolutionary. It's fetishized abuse and violence. I don't personally think it's either, but this feels like one where she's kind of vague posting about a specific show that I have no idea which one. I can't think of a single time I've ever seen this happen, and if I did see it happen, my view on it would be based on, the chemistry between the characters, whether or not it made sense as an ending. Normal things. And as much as people go on about things like having 2 women kissing being fetishization in some way, look, we all know that straight men do kind of fetishize girl-on-girl action, but the only people who tend to actually demand to see that in a cartoon, for instance, tend to be shipping type girls on Tumblr. And you should never, unless you're writing fanfiction, let the tastes and ideas of people from Tumblr influence anything you're working on as a writer. Number 7. Twitter is not an appropriate place to reveal story details. The appropriate place is in the work itself. Well, yeah, but again, this isn't really advice for writers. Aside from perhaps revealing some details that are intended to get people invested in the story or to give it a look, which is no different from posting a trailer, or perhaps answering questions to clear things up after a new chapter or episode or whatever has been released. Sometimes people have got to do that. Number 8. When a character's body count is over 10,000 innocent lives, then that character is no longer redeemable. There really is no way you can just put a figure on something like that, especially when the idea of redemption itself is kind of flexible. We could say that Anakin Skywalker, or Darth Vader, is redeemed at the point of his death, and there maybe it might be acceptable because he's dead. He's paid the biggest price he can pay, to account for all the bad things he's done, and shows remorse in his final moments. But I've seen people say that characters like Subaru from ReZero are irredeemable because they behaved slightly incorrectly towards a female character at one point. You really can't quantify what can and can't be redeemable as far as people in the audience might be concerned. So if you want to try and write a redemption for a character, just go with what you feel is right. Even if you can't successfully redeem that character in everybody's eyes. attempting to will send them on an interesting trajectory if that's what you want to do. So why not attempt it? Number 9. Tip 8 does not apply to characters for whom making them the villain was a stupid, idiotic idea, i.e. Sylvanus Windrunner. At that point, it's just character derailment. I found out from other sources that she's talking about a character from World of Warcraft here, which I'm not a player of. So this is just one of those vague posting things posted, intended as tips, but really just insulting the way that someone else handled characters in their property. And that's all fine and good, but it's not a bloody tip, is it, Lily? But this is where it gets a bit more interesting to me. Number 10. Everything in a story is there because the creator wished it to be there. Trying to explain away bigoted story decisions using world building is a fallacy, because you put it there to begin with. Now, if I'm interpreting this right, this is kind of saying things along the lines of, if your world building has people who mistreat women in it because that's the culture that you've written about in a fantasy story, or you have elements like slavery and things like that, you as a creator put them there because you wanted them to be there. And yes, you did want them to be there. You put them there for story reasons or because it fit with the kind of feel you were going for in the story. It does not mean that you think that that's the way the world should be. It can be there as an obstacle for the characters. It can be there just as a kind of setting thing. If you're in a dark dystopian setting, but nothing particularly bad is ever done to anybody, then that's not going to work. If you're in a pseudo-medieval setting and it's all about how great life is for poor people because it's a socialist utopia, that's not going to serve the kind of story and mood that you want to create. When you're designing a world or a story, you're not designing a perfect utopia that you think everyone should live in. You're not necessarily even trying to teach your audience important life lessons. You're trying to tell an interesting story with engaging characters and events that the people reading it or watching it are going to care about. And if you have to put in some elements there to get the right mood or give those kind of interesting obstacles to your characters, you might put in some things that people might say are bigoted. Yeah, the setting might need to be bigoted, and then when you justify that as world building, that is the justification. It really doesn't mean anything about what the author thinks the real world should be like. Number 11. Don't pair adults with minors. That's paedophilia. Well, sometimes it is, yeah. Sometimes it works with the story and setting. For instance, in the A Song of Ice and Fire books, Daenerys Targaryen is actually only about 13 when she has to marry Khal Drogo. She was aged up quite significantly for the TV show, as were all of the younger characters who were going to have romantic or sex scenes, because it's uncomfortable to see live action actors doing that sort of thing when real children are involved. But when it's a book in a fantasy setting, it tells you something about that setting. And those characters do end up having what can be considered a romantic relationship for that world. These are things that would happen and things that the author put into the story because they work in the setting, not because, it's going to turn on paedophiles. Tip number 11, don't pair adults with minors. That's paedophilia. Yes, she repeated that one because it's that important. And it really feels like kind of pandering to the, antis types who are always criticising anything from Japan for having, teenager characters in it or lollies. And I've already said enough about that topic in other videos, and so won't be going into it again here. But we still have number 12, don't sexualise teenage characters. Well, you can if you're writing for other teenagers, if the story is specifically about teenagers in a very kind of realistic, contemporary kind of way, something like the TV show Skins, where you might want to explore the fact that teenagers do have sexual relationships and do have those kind of feelings for each other. Or in the more kind of anime terms, you may just want the characters to be attractive, and if other kids the same age see that as sexy or whatever, then that's what it's designed for. I talked about this in my video about Nezuko and in my video about Dragon Maid, and I really don't want to keep banging on about it. But if you're going to take a writing tip away from any of this, well, don't do anything in any way sexually related involving characters under 18, because it will not be accepted on just about any publishing platform I can think of, unless you already happen to be a very well-established writer going through a very well-established publisher like George R.R. Martin. 13. Don't make up weird anime excuses for sexualizing teenage characters. Actually 1000, Fusion, age of consent in X country is C Rule 10, which was, of course, don't sexualize teenage characters. And this is coming from Lily Orchard, who wrote the fanfiction Stockholm, which is about baby characters from My Little Pony getting it on with older characters from My Little Pony who are related to them. Yeah, sure, Lily. I think I would take the 1,000-year-old dragon lollies over any of that any day. Number 14. Making a metaphor for gay/trans/ace rep is always inherently inferior to just making a gay/trans/ace character. Well, honestly, a lot of the time when people think something is a metaphor for gay/trans/ace rep, it actually was never intended to be. Putting in allegories for things that can be relatable to different types of situation can be interesting. For instance, if you have a character in a superhero story who has to hide a secret identity and then eventually reveal it to people that he cares about in a slow and gradual way, picking the right moments, and they all react differently. That could be seen as a metaphor for coming out as gay or trans, and so it has meaning to people who've been in that situation. But for other people, it might be relevant because they too have had a different type of secret that they've had to reveal, or tried to hide a different side of their person from the people around them. Maybe somebody who's hidden an addiction or something and finally come out and asked for help would see that story as a kind of allegory for what they've been through, just as somebody who had to come out and tell their family they wanted to transition would feel. If you want to actually tackle the things going on for people in any kind of group, then yes, write real characters with those kind of experiences. The asexual one is kind of a strange one because it's something you typically would only know about a character if it's part of their storyline. So we know that Todd in BoJack Horseman is asexual because it comes up. We know that Parvati in The Outer Worlds is asexual because it comes up. But can we say which ones of the teachers in Harry Potter are asexual? Or really any other character in anything, or even in your real life? People whose love lives you just don't know about, people whose relationship status or, sexuality you might just never know, are commonplace, and they will be commonplace in fictional stories too. So if you deliberately want to make a character asexual representation, then you're going to have storylines that deal with that, because otherwise, when is it ever going to come up? When would you even know that about somebody if they didn't have a reason for it to be something you discussed with them, or something that was important to the development of what they were doing in their life at that time? If those are things you want to tackle in your story, then yes, of course, do it with actual characters rather than with metaphors, But as you can see, using an allegory for something like that may make it so that you can include it in a story that doesn't deal with romance or sex at all. Or you can make it something that speaks to people with other reasons to relate to the events in the story that may not be the same as the allegory you as an author intended, or other people are kind of headcanoning onto it. Just making things applicable to people so that they can relate to them, whether it's in their own lives or in the lives of other people they know, can be a good thing. Most dynamics in fantasy stories are applicable to things in the real world, but they can also be applicable to more than one thing. So if you have a thing in your story that could be applicable to somebody thinking about real world racial issues or sexuality issues, and could also be applicable to a kid who's having some kind of conflict with their friend at school, then why is that a bad thing? 15. If there are humans in your story, restricting gay/trans/ace rep to the non-human characters makes you a huge turd. No, honestly, do what you want. Especially considering on a lot of fantasy and sci-fi type stories, the non-humans are basically equivalent to humans. You know, just with some different features or cultural things going on. If you've got elves and dwarves and your only gay character is a dwarf, then, sorry, that would be Mushoku Tensei. That's not really othering gay people or anything like that. These people all functionally behave the same in the society. They might just have different lifespans or different abilities and things like that. There's really nothing wrong with casting whoever you want in the roles that you want in your story. 16. If the only gay man in your work is a foppish diva, you're a huge turd. There's a whole set of these where it's like, if you do this stereotype, you're a huge turd. I mean, yeah, do try and avoid using really obvious cliches, but you're not a terrible person if that's the character that comes into your mind and you want to put them in your story. Unless it's an insulting stereotype of something that just absolutely doesn't exist and shouldn't exist in your world, make your characters however you want to make them. So again, we have 17. If the only lesbian in your work is an abusive rageaholic with vague angst issues and a codependent relationship to a protagonist, you're a huge turd. I've literally never read or seen anything where that was the case, but okay. 18. If your only non-binary character is a non-human shapeshifter, you're a huge turd. 19. If your only autistic character is an ethically challenged number fetishist, you're a huge turd. 20. If your only black character is a volatile, hyper-angry brute, you're a huge turd. 21. If the only black woman in your cast barely gets any screen time except to be fetishized or fits Rule 20, you're a huge turd. 22. If the only trans woman in your cast is a drag queen in all but name, you're a huge turd. These are all just really about not using overused cliches or stereotypes, but they do kind of also rely on if the only one of this type of person in your cast is this, then you're a bad person for writing it. No, not really. In the cast of a lot of stories, it probably doesn't make sense to have that many people that fit into some of these categories. In others it might, but in some it definitely doesn't. And if the one person you would really like to have in your story happens to fall into one of these categories and also has some of these attributes, you're not a huge turd, you just wanted to write that character. And as long as you make it work, don't let Lily Orchard tell you otherwise. 23. If you force a woman to kiss her abuser, you're a huge turd. Well, yeah, if you force a woman to kiss her abuser, that would be terrible. If you write that a woman who you've made up in a story is in a situation where she is forced to do that by another fictional person, then no, you're not a huge turd. That's just something you came up with that's going to happen in your story. 24. If you sideline every non-white character in your cast to focus on a white boy with anger issues and a tendency towards hostility getting a redemption arc, you're a huge turd. Much as I'm enjoying being called a huge turd every single time with these tips, these amazing writing tips, that I will definitely be applying because they are truly applicable in everything I ever write for the rest of my life, I really don't know what she's referencing here. If your main character is a white boy with anger issues and a tendency towards hostility who becomes a better person, thus getting a redemption arc in Lily's eyes, then they're going to take precedence in the story over the other characters, regardless of their ethnicity. And no, if that's the kind of character you want as your main character, then you're not a huge turd for focusing on them and their story. Never feel like you have to give more screen time to the secondary friend character just because you decided to make them Indian and the main character is white. The only people who will ever applaud you for doing that are the people who prioritize DEI and stuff over telling a good story. Give your characters whatever superficial identity features you want to give them, and focus on them proportionally to how important they are to the story itself. Do not fall into the trap of thinking that if you've got a character who happens to be a white boy, he's, got to be sidelined, he's got to be denigrated or humiliated or any of that. We can see from the reactions to games and TV shows that have prioritized anybody over the white men, that it just doesn't go down that well. Not if those characters are the ones that you originally intended to be the focus. Yes, you should have a balance of characters that fits with your setting, but you can do that without making it feel like an exercise in being super woke or meeting some kind of DEI criteria. If you take something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, for instance, yeah, of course, in a New York police station, you're going to have people of different ethnicities, you're going to have people of different sexualities, and they're going to be dealing with things that may be considered political at times. That is exactly the kind of setting in which it would be messed up if everybody was, straight white guys. But if you want to write a story about, the British Army during World War I, then you don't need to have one of the guys in the trenches questioning whether or not he's non-binary. You don't need to slot in random characters from, Brazil or somewhere just to make everything less white. Your audience will generally only find these things jarring or not jarring if they really don't fit. And the character you want to focus on is just entirely down to you. Number 25. Justifying horny armor designs or horny clothing designs with sexual agency makes you, guess what, a huge turd. Characters don't have sexual agency. You made them that way as a justification. See Rule 10. And Rule 10, I believe, was the one about sexualizing teenagers. Well, no. Usually if you want to design those kinds of things as armor or clothing for your characters, it's because they fit with the genre expectations that you're working with. If you're creating armor for characters in something like Lord of the Rings, you're going to have them have quite functional armor because that's the kind of battling that they're doing. But if you're doing it in a more kind of swords and sorcery kind of world where some of the characters are fighting using magic and aren't really getting struck by swords or whatever, maybe you want to have their armor be, something that's just designed to look good and show prestige or something like that. Yes, bikini armor is completely impractical and completely useless. In fact, it would be probably quite dangerous to use it in real life. But when it's invoked, it's usually on characters who've got things a lot more powerful that they can use to defend themselves that just don't exist in this world. And making them look a certain way for the enjoyment of the audience is just fine. Yes, the seriousness of the setting and the story are going to, affect whether or not you're going to put those kinds of things in. But if the tone and genre allow for it, there's really nothing wrong with doing it if you want to. I've never really seen anyone justify it with sexual agency. In fact, the only time I've ever seen that kind of armor design justified in-world is in Mushoku Tensei, with the characters Shiera and Viera, who are the two sisters who are in Paul's adventuring party. This is never explained in the anime, but the reason why the sister in the bikini armor wears that is because both sisters were badly mistreated after the mass teleportation incident when they were enslaved before being rescued by Paul, and the sister who wears the robes is so deeply traumatized by this that her sister wears the bikini armor to detract attention away from her. And sure, if you're absolutely no fun, you might say, well, the author decided to do that just so he could have a character in bikini armor. And yeah, maybe he did, but he still made it an interesting thing for those characters. It gave them a backstory, and they don't appear very much. But it made them sympathetic, and it also kind of gave a moment where Rudius could realise that Paul wasn't, just attracting these women with skimpy clothes on for the sake of it. It fit with the story, it fit with the setting, the justification it was given in-world made sense for the characters, and outside of in-world, it doesn't need a justification. You want to put a girl in skimpy armour in an anime, you can, it's fine. And then Lily says, number 26, related to the above, if your justification is to just be honest and say you like ogling sexy characters, you're still a huge turd, but slightly less of a turd than the above. Slightly. Well, I'll level with you, Lily. I am a straight woman, and yet I would still rather look at something pretty than something ugly when I'm watching a TV show or playing a video game. I don't need to be ogling sexy characters, but if the characters happen to be sexy, I'm much more interested in playing as them or watching them on a TV screen than I am if they look like, the lady that works behind the counter at the co-op. There are also many different audiences you can be trying to appeal to with the stuff you're writing. And if your audience happens to be the type that likes to look at sexy characters, then you're going to put sexy characters in regardless of whether you like looking at them or not. It's only when you're writing fan fiction that you're expressing your own fantasies and interests all the time when you're writing. Normally, you're trying to produce something that other people will enjoy and that will have some commercial value based on that. If I know my audience like, sexy elf girls, I'll put sexy elf girls in skimpy outfits in my stories all day long. I'll still try to make them interesting characters with interesting dialogue and make them have cool stories and adventures with the main character, but they will be sexy elf girls because people want to read about sexy elf girls. And that's really only just one example of where you might apply that kind of thinking. A lot of the time, the things that go into a story are there for reasons other than the author just really being into that. And that's what you need to remember. If you're writing a story for an audience who loves really steamy enemies to lovers romances, then regardless what tropes you like, you're going to make it a really steamy enemies to lovers romance. You have to think about what other people like and how to provide it to them before trying to write for any particular audience. And yeah, you shouldn't write for an audience you don't respect, an audience that you think are huge turds because they like sexy characters or, tropes that you don't enjoy. But when somebody does produce something for an audience that they do respect, don't ever assume that every decision that they made is based on their own personality or interests. that's almost never the case. Number 27, don't worry about not having everything planned out beforehand. No writer or creator plans everything beforehand, and the ones who say they do are filthy liars. Writers have at best 1 to 2 story beats they're determined to include. Everything else is by the seat of their pants. Well, that's an absolute lie. There are so many different approaches to writing that different authors use, and I do get the kind of grain of truth at the beginning of this. Don't worry about having everything planned out beforehand. I would say some people, before they go into writing their first book, go so deep into having like character sheets for every single character, writing all this lore that's never going to get included in the story, and they end up with hundreds of notebooks filled with things, but none of the novel actually written. And that's why it can take some people years to write their first novel. Whereas if you just have a spark of an idea, you can think of a cool premise and you just sit down and start writing, like a lot of web novel authors do, then you might find that you've written your first novel in a week. But when it comes to professionals, I've done both. I've had novels where I've literally just started out with an idea and no idea what's going to happen in the story, and ended up with, volumes of all kinds of interesting stuff coming to me as I go along. And I've had other ones where I've completely plotted out the whole thing, down to what's going to happen in every single chapter before I've even started writing. I find the latter a lot less fun, and the writing process does become very much not fun when you're doing it for a living. Whereas the more kind of what Dean Wesley Smith, who's quite well known for recommending a writing process called writing into the dark, suggests as kind of discovery writing, which is kind of like pantsing it, but it's more like you're just seeing a little bit into the story as you go through. That kind of thing can be a lot more enjoyable because you don't already know everything that has to be gotten down and you're just going through the process of getting it down. You're, learning things as you go about the characters and the story as you write it. It is more enjoyable, but it's also a bit more scary if you're just starting out, because you may worry that you'll write yourself into a corner, or you won't be able to get to an end point when you want to, and that can be something that can feel quite intimidating. Not so much if you're writing a web novel or something with no definitive need for an ending at any certain time. You can keep it going on for years if you want. But if you're trying to write a novel that you want to publish, you may be scared at first that you just haven't got the experience of resolving everything at the time you want it to if you don't plan it out before. And so that's why these different methods make sense to different people. But again, there are also genre distinctions when it comes to this. Like, you wouldn't start writing a murder mystery without knowing who the solution to the crime was. Those are typically written thinking backwards from the solution and through all the clues that the person solving the mystery is going to see, and then written from the start once all of that's known. So the advice there is really just use whatever approach makes sense to you at the stage in your development as a writer that you're at. The more confidence you have in your ability to tie up stories and things, the easier it will be for you to deal with the kind of going by the seat of your pants approach without getting stressed out. And it is a lot more fun, like I said before. But you will probably still have a few plot points that you want to hit because those were the original idea that you came up with to start writing the story, probably. But if you do feel the need to plot everything out beforehand, know all of the details of the characters before you begin to introduce them, then that's also okay. And that is something that a lot of people do need when they first start out. Just so that they know they've kind of got the pacing figured out, they've got the ending figured out and all of that stuff before they start dedicating time into the actual prose. Everybody's different, and Lily is the one that's a filthy liar by saying that no writer or creator plans everything beforehand. But then Lily's never written anything except a very, very sketchy fan fiction, lest we forget. Number 28. Don't try and do what Avatar did. You can't. Even the people who made Avatar can't make another show do what Avatar did. This really feels like it's more just a bitchy message towards other people making cartoons rather than a genuine tip for anybody thinking about writing something. Because if you admire what Avatar did, then why wouldn't you try to do what Avatar did, whatever that is in her mind? What did it do? It had good characters, it had an interesting story, a good balance between comedy and drama, interesting world building, a nice way of combining the kind of anime influence with more of a Western style, satisfying character arcs, all of that stuff. Why would you not try to do that if you were working in that kind of genre? Or if she means do what Avatar did in terms of its popularity and fandom, then, well, if you're an aspiring writer making a new comic or something like that, you're going to know that, yeah, you're probably not going to hit those levels of success, at least not with that first project. But if you see Avatar as excellence, then, yeah, strive to do what Avatar did. This isn't so much advice as just Lily sort of saying that Avatar was lightning in a bottle and nothing will ever kind of replicate its success or the effect it had on its audience. And I like Avatar, I like it a lot, but all the things that were good about it don't mark it as the end of creativity. It wasn't that one true perfect story that every creative has been working towards creating, because if it was, there'd be no point in having any more stories. We'd just keep on watching that one for the rest of time, wouldn't we? We don't give up just because we saw something really good. We take inspiration from having seen something really good and try to make something new. Number 29. Low-stakes interpersonal conflict will always be more satisfying in the long run than high-stakes saving the world. Friends is more popular than your favourite anime for a reason. Lily, you know that there are some quite popular anime that are only about low-stakes interpersonal conflict, don't you? I don't remember anyone in My Dress Up Darling or Uzaki-chan Wants to Hang Out ever having to save the world. But, I mean, I don't disagree that saving the world high-stakes stuff isn't quite as engaging as smaller kind of street-level conflicts when it comes to things like the superhero genre. I always kind of preferred those Netflix series like Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, where they had like their own villain that they had their beef with and everything. And there were stakes, but they weren't necessarily going to involve big old sky beams and stuff at the end. I always preferred those kind of stories from the MCU rather than the reality itself is at stake kind of stories. But whichever scale you're working at, you will have the interpersonal kind of dramas building up towards that too. Whether your favourite scene is the climactic battle or the way the characters interact with each other when they're nervous before the battle begins. In a good high-stakes story, both of those things will be present. Lower stakes stories, yeah, they're a popular genre in their own right. But that's not to say you can't write a big story, a big epic fantasy story like Lord of the Rings, without there being very good, interesting interpersonal drama. And character dynamics that may well sit with people longer than the ultimate good versus evil type fight. The way that teams are formed, the way that people have to maybe put aside differences and things to join together against a bigger enemy. Those kind of things can all include that interpersonal conflict that seems low stakes on a scene-by-scene basis, but all adds up to what makes the end of the world type stakes actually something you care about. Because if you're going to do those kind of stakes, you have to actually believe that the world that they're fighting for is worth saving. And you believe that because of the way the characters you've been introduced to care about each other and interact with each other. So I do kind of agree with Lily to a point, in that you can have low stakes interpersonal conflict without high stakes drama and it still works really well. But you can't have high stakes drama without the personal drama as well. Even at the most basic level of, a children's show about good versus evil, you do expect things to be kind of there in terms of the friendships and allyships on the good people's side. You got to see those turtles eating pizza together in a sewer to care about them. Number 30. Choose whether you're a comedy or drama at the start and stick to it. Don't make a comedy and turn it into a drama later on. That just annoys people. Well, dramedies are a thing. Also, most successful comedies do have some element of drama in them. Not all, of course, but most of them. There are even episodes of things like South Park that do have some heavy dramatic features to them. And if you look at something like BoJack Horseman, there are episodes of that are hugely impactful that don't really have any comedy at all. And nobody minded about that. I mean, yeah, if I started watching Konosuba, enjoyed it for a season, and then season 2 was, some harrowing tale based on the genocide in Rwanda, then yeah, probably that would be a tonal shift too far. But a balance between comedy and drama that does tend to shift depending on the arc and the moment, that's actually something to aspire to attaining. Whether you're writing a sitcom or a really serious grimdark fantasy story. There are funny moments in Berserk, there are funny moments in Breaking Bad, there are funny moments in Game of Thrones, and some unintentionally funny moments in Game of Thrones in the last couple of seasons. But then there are moving, dramatic, tense moments in most sitcoms and most series that we think of as pure comedy. This just isn't a good rule. Now, since we're coming up to an hour into reading these, and I've just hit number 30, I'm thinking that this might end up being a 3-parter. Because my voice is really starting to suffer after talking for, it ends up as more than an hour after I deleted the bits that I didn't like when I was talking. But there are another 70 of these tips to go. So I think that will be another 2 videos. Let me know what you think about the tips in this video, and please consider subscribing if you want to see parts 2 and 3 when they inevitably come out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.